Okay, guys, we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Let me open us up in prayer, and then we'll get rolling. God, we thank you that, Lord, I'm thankful for my church, and I love the people here, and I am excited to be able to, Lord, share with them things that I've learned and things that you have brought me through, Lord, so that as James talked about on Sunday, Lord, we're all part of the body and we all have different things, Lord. And, Lord, I'm excited to be able to use what you have given me, Lord. And I just pray that it would open hearts or give or equip Christians to be better ambassadors for you. And that it would help people to love you more, to know you more, and to share you more with the world. And it's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. Okay, so last time, no one wanted to get in front of the microphone and ask a question. So tonight, if you would put on the last slide real quick. So I've got my cell phone number on here, and I'm going to take, if you guys have any, if you want to write this down now, there's my cell phone number. And so if you have any questions that pop up along the way that you want to ask, I left my cell phone down here. So I'll start scrolling through during the Q&A time. And if anybody has any questions they want to ask, but then I'll also look there as well. Some of you all may have a question that you find is embarrassing or you wouldn't want to ask it in public. So that gives you another option or another way to ask a question. So let me do a brief recap, and you can leave that slide up for just a second. Let me do a brief recap of week one for some of you all that may not have been here. But the first thing we learned last week is that faith is not blind or irrational. So faith in the biblical sense and in the Christian sense is trust. So just like we use the example of an airplane, that it involves knowledge, knowing about the plane, that it's safe, that the pilots are certified and can get you from point A to point B. You know statistics about flying a plane. You have knowledge, but faith is actually stepping onto the plane and investing yourself in it to be able to get you there. So in the same way, Christian faith involves knowledge and trust in Jesus. We also talked about there's multiple ways to know something. And Brandon, I don't have a timer up there yet. And I just don't want to go over. There's multiple ways that we can know things. So objections that will come to us from the world are that, science is the way that we know things, or the experts. But you Christians, you just have faith. Well, actually, we know things a lot of different ways. We know things by intuition or tacit inference, like we just infer things. We talked about, all of you men know your wife has this sixth sense and she's able to read somebody and judge them, and you're like, how did you know that? Well, I just knew. I could just tell. He's not a good guy. And then sure enough, a few months later, comes out, he's in jail, he did something wrong. We know things by experience, right? Like riding a bike. It's an experiential knowledge that we gain by riding a bike. Even though we know a bunch of facts, we don't actually gain the real knowledge until we get on the bike and learn how to ride. We learn things through inference, which is what the whole scientific method is built on. We know some things, moral truths, and some other truths about ourselves just by just knowing them. So we know certain things are right and wrong. We don't come to that through some sort of deductive argument. We just know certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And those are the things we really know. Other things that we know are just preloaded into us, okay? That would be like logical truths or mathematical truths. We know some things by authority. So some things that we know as Christians, we know on the authority of somebody else. So a lot of scientific stuff that we say we know, we actually know it on the basis of the authority of somebody else who said it to us. And we know a lot of things based on authority. And then lastly, we know things through our senses as well. And the Bible teaches that we know certain things, but also that faith is trust in God. So we know certain things about God and about Jesus, but faith is trusting in Him for certain things as well. We looked at a couple misconceptions that knowledge does not equal certainty. So we're not about trying to be 1,000% certain about something, although we can arrive at that at times. Just because you're not certain of something or that you couldn't possibly be wrong doesn't mean that you don't know something. Also, just because you can't show something to be true doesn't mean that you don't know that it's true. So a lot of Christians will get bullied and beat up saying, well, prove to me that God is really real. Well, gosh, I don't know how to do that. Well, that doesn't mean that you don't know it. Just because you can't prove it, just pop back at the person and say, prove to me that the earth is a sphere. Well, I don't know, I saw it in a picture, or I read it in a science book. Well, same sort of thing applies. Just because you can't show something to be true doesn't mean that you don't know that it's true. The Bible makes it clear that we know certain things about God, even apart from faith even. And then also, lastly, there are certain things that can keep us from knowing things. So immorality can keep us from knowing something. So if we're living an immoral lifestyle, we can begin to be blinded to what actually is morally true and good. So you only have to look at maybe the Nazis and what happened in Nazi Germany to know that Hitler became morally desensitized to the point where he could not know certain moral truths. Like he kind of knew them here, but he was blinded to them because of immorality. And that can happen in our own lives with sin. That's why sin is so dangerous. It can blind us from knowing things. We have to be very careful. That's why Proverbs says to guard your heart, for from it's the wellspring of life. And when we don't guard our hearts and we let sin entangle us, we lose the ability to know certain things, especially spiritual things. And we lose the ability to have faith. So sin is the enemy of faith. Also, pride, prejudice, laziness, other things can keep us from knowing. So, this week we're going to move on to something that we know as Christians, and we're going to talk about how we know it, and it's about Jesus, the foundation and fundamentals of our faith. Now, if I took a survey of why is it that you're a Christian, likely in almost any Christian or church setting that I took that survey, why do you believe in Jesus? Why are you a Christian? I'm probably going to get one of three answers, okay? And they're going to be, number one is I was raised that way. Number two was God changed my life, or I was this way and now I'm this way. Another one would be that I experienced something or I saw something that convinced me that it was true. All right? Now, none of these are wrong in and of themselves, and actually I think they can be good things and they can be good evidence. But the problem is it's not enough for us, and none of those things are the foundation of our faith. So we may enter into the faith that way, but those aren't our reasons for believing Jesus ultimately. And if you went out and started witnessing some Mormons, they would tell you they're a Mormon because they was raised that way, or they were this way and now they're this way, or they may have saw something or had some prayer answered or something of that sort. Malcolm X, who became a Muslim, had his life changed because of some vision he had in prison. And it changed his life. And he ended up, later on in life, rejecting Islam. But so we want to be careful in giving a reason or basing our faith on an experience. As much as experience can be helpful and good, we want to be careful about letting that be the foundation for us, especially if we're defending our faith against any sort of opposition. And this would be important with our kids as well, as they would enter college and they're going to be faced with intellectual attacks, which even all of us are constantly bombarded with that. So for the next little bit, we're going to look at reasons why we can trust Jesus. Now, I talked last week a little bit about how, as a Christian, we have a web of beliefs, okay? And by that, I mean that certain beliefs are very core and central to our faith, and other ones are out here on the periphery. So imagine like a spider web, okay? And if Jesus is at the center, if that belief doesn't hold, the whole web falls apart, okay? But if something out here on the periphery, so let's say that, let's pick on Calvinism for a second, okay? So let's say that whether or not that's true or not, or that certain way to view Scripture, if we found out that that wasn't exactly right, that doesn't mess up the rest of our belief system. Same with the age of the earth, for instance, okay? Or did humans live with dinosaurs, okay? We may have a certain view of Genesis that we think is right, and if pressure begins to be put on us, even if we think it's wrong, even if we were wrong about that, it doesn't make the web fall apart. So a lot of Christian kids that go off to college lose their faith because this perceived tension maybe between science and religion, when in fact, the beliefs that are being questioned are really just out here on the periphery. Okay, so our core fundamental belief is that Jesus is God, that He is our Savior, that the gospel is true. So many of the New Testament Christians, they didn't even have a New Testament. They were Christians in virtue of the fact that they knew about Jesus or knew certain things about Jesus. They had heard the apostles' teachings, and they believed Jesus was God and that He was Messiah. And that was the foundation of their faith. So that's why we want to focus on Jesus. And as we go through times of doubt or struggle or maybe pressure from the world to try to get us to not believe, let's remember that the core is that we trust in Jesus. And when we're solid on that core, we can often withstand the pressure from the culture on these other areas. So like the whole sexuality and same-sex marriage thing is really putting a ton of pressure on us. And you have a lot of people capitulating on, man, does the Bible really teach this? Does it not teach this? The culture is screaming at me. But again, Jesus is the core for us, so we shouldn't let those other things rock us. And that's really important to remember, and it has been for me as I've gone through a dark night of the soul. That is the anchor to hold on to. Even when everything else seems covered by clouds or water and I can't see, he's the anchor to hold on to during whatever the struggle is. And this is why Paul says in Corinthians that if Christ hadn't been raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So if Jesus isn't who he said he was, and if he wasn't raised from the dead, we have no reason to come to church, okay? Christianity is done. So that's why focusing on Jesus is important. So now what I'm going to do tonight is present you all with what I would call a cumulative case for Jesus being who he said he was. So how many of you all like detective shows? Okay, I love detective shows, right? And so when you think about convicting somebody, there's two types of evidence. There's direct evidence and indirect, or like circumstantial. Thank you. And so only eyewitness counts as this direct kind, and everything else is circumstantial. So like, DNA and fingerprints and your alibis and all that kind of stuff. That's circumstantial evidence, and then eyewitness is your direct evidence. So the more circumstantial evidence, and most cases are built on circumstantial evidence. And even actually the most powerful cases are built on circumstantial evidence because eyewitnesses can lie. So the more evidence that we have into something, the more powerful the case becomes. And so we're going to do that looking at the person of Jesus. We're going to build a case. And a lot of these things are going to be things that you probably already see. You just haven't thought about it in this way. So this is not some highly academic thing, okay? This is something that the ordinary Christian can see and know themselves. And I just want to help you think through that so that you can have these things in the back of your own mind. So for the purposes of our talk, I am not going to be assuming that the Bible is the inspired word of God, okay? And the reason I'm doing that is that I want to show you that if you're presenting the gospel to an unbeliever, you don't have to present them, hey, this is God's word. And I think you should believe it's God's word, and it's inspired. And it's okay to tell someone it's God's word. But I'm wanting to show you that we can present a really strong case for the person of Jesus without making that claim. And that'll help you with someone who's a doubter or a skeptic or that sort of thing. And so really the only thing that I'm going to presuppose, and I'm going to argue for it real quick, is that the gospel accounts, the four gospel accounts that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are generally reliable. They're historically reliable. So let me do a quick cumulative case for the reliability of the gospels, and then we'll move on to why we can trust Jesus, that he is who he said he was. Okay, so and again, think about a cumulative case evidence. We have these four historical documents, and we want to think about how we can verify or test that they are true, all right? So what are things that we can look for to know if it's true? So, and just like in these detective cases, when they're assessing an eyewitness, there are a lot of things that they can look at about the person and about their story to know if it's true, if it checks out. So they'll question their alibis, and they'll question where they were and what they had on, and to see if their story changes over time. They'll see if they were actually an eyewitness of what they saw. And there are many pieces that will go into, is this good testimony or is it not good testimony? And we can look at the Gospels in the same way. So the first test is we're going to look at archaeology. So if the authors that wrote the Gospels lived during the time that it was written, and they saw the things that had happened, we would expect them to get many things right about the geographical details of the area. So we would expect them to get politicians right, and customs of the day right, and names right, and locations right. Because again, think if you were going to write a fiction or mythical story about the city of Owensboro from 100 years ago, and in a world with no internet, no Wikipedia, none of that kind of stuff, do you think you could get the mayors right and the street names right and the names that the people had then right and the roads right and the directions right? Do you think you could get that stuff right? I grew up in this town. Like, I know this town like the back of my hand, and I could not get that stuff right. So in order to get that right, you have to be there and see this stuff. So let me just I'm going to give you real quick a few archaeological facts, and there are hundreds of them, and there are multiple skeptics. Sir William Ramsay is probably the most famous one, who was a skeptic that went into the New Testament assuming it was false, and after a while became a believer that specifically Luke is a first-rate historian and that everything that he says checks out. And if anything, we should be going out into the field with a Bible in our hands, expecting to find what we have in here. So for a long time, people assumed that the Syrian governor Quirinius that conducted the census did not live. But in the 19th century, they found some coins with his name on. They also found an inscription. John in his gospel talks about the pool of Bethesda, and that's where a miracle happened, and that pool was surrounded by 5 porticos. And again, think about how specific that detail is, that there was this pool in this certain area, and then it had these 5 porticos around it, okay? And again, Jerusalem and this whole area was ravaged by the Romans afterwards, so a ton of stuff was destroyed. Well, in 1888, archaeologists excavated in an area in Jerusalem, and they found the remains of a pool with steps leading down from one side and 5 shallow porticos on the other side. So a little tiny detail. So we're having these little touch point details that are corroborating that the Gospels are true here, they're true here, they're true here, they're true here. And we could go on and on with archaeology. It's a fascinating field, but it very much, specifically with the New Testament, is continually corroborating and showing, yep, Matthew got it right here, John got it right here, Luke got it right here. Okay, the next one as a marker of truth is what I would call the criterion of embarrassment. So the skeptic would say that the Gospels were written by these people who were looking to start a movement and gain power for themselves, which is ridiculous because they all got killed, and they stood to gain pretty much nothing. But if you were the apostles and you were going to write this story to get people to follow you, they really put in a bunch of really embarrassing stuff. And if they were writing a myth to promote their views and for people to follow them, they would have done it more like Joseph Smith or Muhammad, right? That we are these, okay, the apostles are idiots in the gospel accounts. They're constantly doing dumb stuff. They're rejecting Jesus. I mean, Peter's denying Jesus to a young girl and saying, I don't know that guy. And he's slicing off a guy's ear, and they're, Jesus, are you really God? And then John the Baptist, who's like the most righteous person, he's like, Jesus, are you really the Messiah? Like, so if you're trying to promote that this guy really is the Messiah, like, you wouldn't write all this embarrassing stuff in there. Another one, so women in first century Palestine, their views, they were not seen as credible witnesses, and they could not testify in the court of law. So very low view of women in Rome and in Palestine in that area. And who do the gospel accounts report as the first eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection? Women. And who is it that Jesus is befriending and as part of the tribe of Christians early on, and very important people? It's women. Others, Jesus, and we'll get more into the women issue later and with some really cool stuff. Jesus said a lot of weird stuff that you would not make up, like, eat my flesh and drink my blood. So if you're trying to start this movement, you don't put in bizarre sayings and invent them. So these are embarrassing things, and embarrassment is a marker of truth because you wouldn't have put it in otherwise unless it was true. Another one, if you're trying to promote this view that this guy is God, they make Jesus so human. He cries, he fasts, and he's hungry, and he gets beaten and torn down and killed. And many, many other things about him are really, almost sometimes it's uncomfortable. And Jesus doesn't even outright come out and say, I am God in the Gospels. There's sort of a little bit of a secret to his messianic movement. And so if you're trying to promote this idea that Jesus is God and you never write it in there that he said, I am God. So all these things they point to, so we're building our case here for the Gospels, that These are all markers of truth. Another one is the consistency of Jesus' character. So again, we have 4 different reports from 4 different writers, and they all portray a Jesus that in many nuanced little ways are the same person throughout all 4. So, I mean, if 4 of us were going to try to write a story to make somebody God, I mean, how different would our stories be with this person? But in all the Gospels, you see Jesus kind of being secretive about his mission. We see him retreating to pray. We see him being sarcastic with the religious leaders. We see his love for sinners, his intolerance of hypocrisy, and it's consistent across all 4. And this leads into the next, which is another marker of truth, is that there are discrepancies in the gospel accounts. So was there 2 angels at Jesus' tomb, or was there 1 angel? One gospel reports 2, another one reports 1. On the sign above Jesus' cross, all 4 gospel authors talk about it, and all 4 say a different version of what was up there. Now, there's a guy named J. Warner Wallace who's a cold case detective, and now he's a Christian. He was an atheist and looked at the evidence and became a Christian. And one of the things he said when he was doing homicide detective work, when he would get a call from dispatch, he would say, the very first thing that I want you to do before I come out in the field is tell the officers immediately to separate all the witnesses, because I don't want them getting together and making sure their stories are like this. Because what if everyone told the exact same thing as a witness, what would you think immediately? They corroborated. They got together and they colluded and they came up with this story. So the fact that there is coherence and cohesion in the Gospels is one marker of truth. But if they all said exactly the same thing, we'd say, well, they just all copied off each other. One guy had a story and they all just copied it. So the skeptic would like to say, well, there's differences. Well, okay, well, if they were all the same, then he'd say, well, they all just got together and made up this story. Well, you can't have it both ways. So the differences that create problems for some people are actually a marker of truth, because all witnesses see things from a different angle, often in ways that you can't even figure out how to reconcile them. So imagine this, like 2 people are standing at the cross, and one person says, he writes, says, man, Jesus was crucified. They nailed his hands and his feet to the cross, and I watched him die. And another person says, man, I saw Jesus. He was up on Golgotha, and I watched him die, and I watched them stab him with a spear. And you say, well, man, those 2 people said, one guy said Jesus was killed with a spear, and another guy said he was nailed to this cross up there. Well, which one was it? Well, it was both. It was both. So differences are good. Another one that's a really cool evidence is what's called undesigned coincidences. Okay, so this is where, again, another marker of truth, and again, our case is building here for the truthfulness of the Gospels. Another marker of truth is when 2 different stories are giving details that when you look at both of them and step back, they actually harmonize really well with each other. So let me give you one example, and you can go and research this more, is that in the book of John, we learn early on when he calls some of the disciples, one of them is Philip. Now, we hardly ever hear of Philip in all the Gospels, but it just mentions in passing that that Jesus called Philip, and he was from Bethsaida. Okay? Now, later on, we learn that at the feeding of the 5,000, which is reported in all 4 Gospels, Jesus turns to Philip, who is probably the only other time he's mentioned in the Gospels. You never hear him. And he turns to him and says, where should we buy food? Now, why would Jesus ask Philip? Who was responsible for the money? It was Judas, so you'd maybe expect him to turn to Judas, or maybe Peter or John, which are very prominent. But he turns to Philip. Well, why would he turn to Philip and say, where should we buy food? Well, in Luke's account of the feeding of the 5,000, we learn that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida. So you have this little detail early on in John saying that Philip, just in passing, was from Bethsaida. And you have Jesus turning to Philip saying, where should we buy food? And then in Luke's account, we learn that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida. This is not authors trying to collude. It's just passing little details that show, hey, this actually makes all the sense in the world how this goes together. Another marker of truth, and there are a bunch of these in the New Testament. And the last one is names, okay? So I have a question. How many of y'all here are named Gertrude or Bernard or any other old names, right? Names change very quickly, right? Like even every name now is like Hayden and Caden and Braden and whatever. So, but you go back 50 years and the names are totally different. So somebody did a study of the names during the first 50 years in Palestine, And there's a list of popularity of names that people had in first century Palestine. Whereas if people lived over in Egypt during that time, or maybe 100 years after, would have had different names. And the names that are recorded in our Gospels match up exactly with the names that were the most popular during that time, almost in that exact order, which shows that the people that wrote it knew the names of people that lived then, and it matches up with the names that you would expect. So back to if I was going to write a history of Owensboro, or a myth about something that happened in Owensboro, and I was inventing names right now, I probably would get them all wrong. And people would say, that wasn't people's names back then. It was Gertrude and, Bernard or whatever. So all these things are markers of truth of the gospel accounts, that they are historically trustworthy. And then the last thing to remember before we move on is that the Old Testament was completed before Jesus was born. So the Hebrew canon was fixed and completed before Jesus arrived on the scene. And in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves over in the Middle East, and they've dated those, and they've got numerous documents and dating methods that have shown that, and these were copies of texts of the Old Testament that are dated to before when Christ came. And there's multiple other reasons to know this too, but so the Old Testament was completed before Jesus. Now, with all that in mind, let me start giving you reasons why we trust Jesus. Okay? The first three are going to come right out of our Bible, and specifically the Old Testament. So the first one is going to be what I'm going to call narrative fulfillment. So whether or not you believe the Old Testament is true or not is beside the point, just for a second. The Old Testament tells a story of the world. It tells a story of God creating man in his image to be in relationship with him. It tells a story of how man broke that relationship. And it tells a story about God promising to restore that relationship with man, initiating a covenant, initiating promises that were to come. And we see the sin and the brokenness of that relationship emphasized over and over and over, and man trying to reach out and falling and failing, and God sending people to help. And it seems like they're getting closer to God, that relationship's being restored a little bit, but it's still broken. And we see, and he sends prophets, so people to speak on behalf of God to the people so they can know what he's like and who he is and what he expects. They send priests. God sends priests to be able to help bridge the sin gap with sacrifices so that people can at least be in proximity and in some form of relationship with God through the sacrifices. And he also sent kings because people need a leader, someone. People were supposed to be under God, but God's sending someone to lead them in righteousness. And then along comes someone, Jesus, who claims to be not only the king, but he also speaks for God in a way, in a teaching, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, that is just unparalleled, and its effect on the world is tremendous. So he acts as a prophet, just like the Old Testament prophets, except he ramps it up tremendously. And that's why everyone around Jesus is like, no one is taught like this man. He speaks with authority, and he does when you read the Gospels. And he's a king, and he also gives himself as a sacrifice. So all of these things in the Old Testament, they find their fulfillment, almost as if the whole Old Testament was waiting for him. And that's why after his resurrection, they look back and they're like, holy crap, like it's all over the place. We're not supposed to say crap, are we, church? Okay, so that's number one. Number two is what I'm going to call typological fulfillment. So, and this is going to tie into this narrative, is that all throughout the Old Testament, and it would have been hard to see it before Jesus, but now that Jesus has come, there's all sorts of things in the Old Testament that were like small pictures of him before. So the first one we'll look at, and there's a ton of them. The first one's Abraham and Isaac. So God had promised Abraham a son. He made this initial covenant with him that he was going to bless all the nations through him and his offspring. So he has one legitimate child through his wife, the son of promise. And then God asks him to sacrifice his only son. So they go out and to this mountain, which is very likely to be where modern-day Jerusalem would be. And he says, I want you to go up and sacrifice him. So think about this. So you have Abraham, and he has servants there, and he says, stay here. My son and I are going to go up to sacrifice to God, and then we'll come back down. So Isaac, it says, puts the wood on his back and walks up the hill with Abraham. And Isaac willingly gets on the altar, and he's likely a teenager. And so his dad is tying him down to the altar. And then God provides a sacrifice, a substitute for Isaac. So fast forward 1,500 years, Jesus, the only Son of the Father, walks up the hill outside of Jerusalem willingly with wood on his back and is sacrificed. Another one, Joseph. This is probably my favorite one. So Joseph was the favorite of his father, but hated by his brothers. He told his brothers that they were to bow down to him, that they would bow down to him. They rejected him, and they were going to kill him, and they threw him in the pit. And as far as his father was concerned, he was dead. They took back his bloody robe. Okay, then he's sold off into slavery, and then he's falsely accused. He's sent down to the pit in this prison with these two other criminals. He gets out. He's raised up to the right hand of Pharaoh, and because of what he's done, he blesses all the Egyptians and saves them through the famine. And then after his brothers come back and they're forced to come in, and they develop this, they have this guilt, and they end up repenting. And at first they don't recognize him, and then they see him for who he is. Okay, so let's fast forward to Jesus. He's a favorite of the Father. He comes and tells the Jews that they are to worship him. They reject him. They sell him off. They kill him. He's raised. He's seated up to the right hand of the Father, and he goes and blesses the Gentiles. And then at some point, the scriptures say that the Jews will turn back to him and see him. And so you have this picture now looking back. It's like, wow, like he's right there in the Old Testament. And we could go on and on and on with examples, but they're all over the book of Genesis. I think Passover is another one too. So you look at Passover. Jesus, the Passover event was the major salvation event that led to the Old Covenant and the giving of the law. And it was where the blood was put over the doorposts and the angel of death passed over, and they were saved, and then they go through the water and into the promised land. Okay, and Jesus was crucified on Passover, and his blood causes death to pass over us. And then we are saved, right? And he talked about his death as a baptism. And then we have the new covenant given right after that salvation event on the day of Pentecost. And Pentecost was a celebration of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Okay, that's number 2. And again, cumulative case here. We're just building our case for Jesus. Number 3 is prophecy. So there are many prophecies in the Old Testament, and we have to be careful with this. How we do this, but there are many clear prophecies in the Old Testament that foreshadow Jesus. All right, and so Deuteronomy 16 and Deuteronomy 34 talks about a prophet like Moses coming who would do the signs like Moses. And again, Moses was almost like a prophet, priest, king, but just kind of a lesser order. We have Psalm 22, which is basically a crucifixion description. But it's talking about David. It's not even necessarily a prophecy, but it really isn't fulfilled in David because David didn't go through the type of suffering that it talks about there. But when you look back from Jesus, it's exactly what Jesus went through. It talks about that the Messiah was going to be a light to the Gentiles. But the best one is Isaiah 53, okay? So if you're ever encountering someone who's a skeptic, just say, hey, and don't tell them what you're doing. Just say, hey, I'd like to read you a passage from the Bible real quick, and I want you to tell me who it's about. Don't tell them where it comes from. And just start reading it to him. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of his people, and they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. So he died. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He's put him to grief, and his soul makes an offering for guilt. But he shall see his offspring and prolong his days. So the person that died is then going to see his offspring and have his days prolonged. And out of the anguish of his soul, he will see and be satisfied. And we could go on. So who's that talking about? It was Jesus. But Isaiah was written like 600 or 700 years before Jesus even came on the scene. And if you ask anyone, you read that passage and say, who's this talking about? Well, Jesus. Where do you think it came from? Well, probably the New Testament. Well, no, actually not. It came out of the book of Isaiah. And there's many prophecies in the Old Testament. There's probably 10 or 12 that are really good and powerful, and then a lot of others that can be as well. So, okay, next one we're going to move on to is Jesus' teaching. No one has ever taught like Jesus. So I don't care if you're a Christian or a non-Christian, you look at who has impacted the world morally more than anyone else, hands down it's Jesus. Our Western civilization has been turned upside down because of the teachings of Jesus. Those flourishing and morality come with it. Oppression is relieved. Women are lifted up. Slavery is abolished. When Christianity in its purest form goes forth, people flourish. It's because of Jesus' truth, his moral truth. When you read the things he said, they're so powerful, yet so simple and so revolutionary. At first, they bother us because they're so true, but then they're so right and so good. And so when people read, we say the same thing that his hearers heard. Who is this man? Who talks like this? He speaks like someone with authority. I've listened to many, many, many PhDs and theologians and smart people. No one talks like Jesus. And he did not have a degree. He didn't go to Southern Seminary. He didn't go to Harvard. He spent his whole life working in a small podunk town. And think about this. How can someone 2,000 years ago have the ability to peer inside my heart like he does? Again, more markers of truth or the power or the knowledge that comes from this person. And who can possess this kind of knowledge? His spiritual insight. And then all this is tied to his claim to be God. So you can't accept him as this moral teacher without also accepting this claim to be God because they're so tightly interwoven together. Okay, number 5, his miracles. So again, even if someone doesn't accept the miraculous claims of the New Testament, there's something striking about the miracles of Jesus. So if you look at the false gospels, and we talked about this in Sunday school the other day, that if you're inventing a story about somebody, a myth, and you look at these false gospels, the miracles that they have Jesus doing are really bizarre things. So like when Jesus is a little kid, they have him like taking dirt out of the ground and like forming birds and then they like fly out of his hand. And then I think they attacked and killed somebody. Or no, people were bumping into him and he was just smiting them dead. Or in the Gospel of Peter, which was written in like 200 or 300 AD, you have the cross following Jesus out of the tomb, kind of like this weird thing kind of going like this. And Jesus' head is like up in the clouds, right? So, but the miracle claims of the Gospels are really controlled. And they're miraculous and supernatural, but they're also really constrained as well. And then secondly to that, they're really tied to Jesus' character and his theology. So his miracle claims are really wrapped up in his love for people and his sovereignty and control. And so the miracles really, although they're supernatural, they're also tied to all these details that we looked at and the historical reliability of the Gospels. So they're really interwoven with the history of the Gospels, but then they're also really interwoven into the character and person of Jesus and the theology that he teaches. And then also, these miracle claims come from eyewitnesses who lived within a few years of Jesus and who were living in the same geography. So there's a lot of credibility to the reports that were given. And again, even if you don't accept these, how many persons of history do we have that even claimed, number one, to be God, and number two, it's even well known among skeptics that Jesus was at least a wonder worker or a miracle worker of some sorts, or a sorcerer or whatever. But who else do we have claims of people with eyewitnesses as close to the events as the gospel accounts that are performing miracles. There's no other person in history like this, even on the face of it, which should cause us to look. Okay, number 6 is Jesus' life, and this is going to tie really closely to his teaching and to his miracles. But there's something about the person of Jesus that seems or appears on the face of it to be utterly different than all the rest of humankind. So his love and compassion for the weak and the marginalized. So his whole life was spent rejecting things like religious superiority or money and power and fame, and serving the weak and the marginalized. Which again, if you're going to go out and start a movement that you're trying to gather a mass following, that's not necessarily the route that you go. That's not the route that Joseph Smith took. That's not the route that Muhammad took. Those were more like big, massive campaigns. I'm going to lead you into the promised land sort of thing. Let's kill some people. Let's get some money. That's how those movements were started. But Jesus is it's like an upside-down kingdom. And there's something about that it's not the way that we would go about it, but also we feel or we see this, that it's good and it's right, which pulls on one of these ways of knowing, this intuition that there's something right and true and good. And so the same person that all these claims are about, the same person that taught these moral teachings that are higher than anyone else, is the same person that's living this type of life that none of us live, but we know is so good and right. So he had courage, he had honesty, he had humility, his servant leadership. So I'm in the business world, I'm an entrepreneur, and servant leadership is like the thing. And it works in business. It's the way to run a successful business. Even authors like Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, would say that this is one of the key things that makes a great and successful company. Well, who founded servant leadership? It was Jesus. His humility. So even though he claims to be God and is doing these things, it's tempered by this amazing humility that we know, again, is right and good. And again, all of these are tied up in this claim to be God. And you can't break them apart. So you're being forced to look down at this figure that you can't get away from. So not only is he fulfillment of the narrative of the Old Testament, not only is fulfilled in all these types, not only has he been prophesied about, not only has he done these miracle claims, but he has this amazing teaching, and then it's backed up by this life that is like, this is so good. And then next, number 7, is that there is no one in history, in either history or fiction, that's ever been written that had the power of Jesus or the moral qualities of Jesus. So you look at any book, any fiction book, any history book, there's no one that's been written about that had the power like Jesus had, and then or had the moral goodness of Jesus. And you certainly don't have any figure that has both of them, which just goes to show you that even human authors have not been able to create a person as great as Jesus. Otherwise, we would have seen it in literature. And if the gospel writers did it, they would have been the first since then, been the first up to that point, and the last since then. Okay, number 8 is his resurrection. And I'm going to go through a quick resurrection argument in 2 minutes. So there are 4 basic facts, or we can say 5. 5 facts that almost every skeptical scholar would agree to, even someone like Bart Ehrman. And most people who wouldn't agree with this are, because most of this stuff is well attested even outside of the Bible by other historians, Roman historians, Jewish historians. So there are basically 5 facts about what happened surrounding the events of Jesus' death, okay? Number 1 is that he died by crucifixion. Almost everyone would agree to that. That there was an empty tomb, okay? This is the one that's probably the most contested, but there was an empty tomb, all right? That his disciples claimed to have had a multifaceted experience with him multiple times after his death. So you can call that what you want, but all of them and many others claim to have seen and touched and talked to Jesus. Paul, who was a persecutor of the church, was converted. Again, this is very well attested. And the church sprang up into existence in the most hostile environment possible. and we're willing to die for this. Now, for someone who does not want to believe in the resurrection, you have got to explain those facts. And really the best explanation on the market, if you're a skeptic, is that the disciples hallucinated and then really believed their hallucinations. I mean, and I'm being serious. Like, if you look at the debates on this, like, that's pretty much the only game in town in terms of a competing hypothesis. And there's nothing in medical literature. I actually did a paper on this, and I read in some of the literature that about hallucination experiences. Someone wrote a paper on this. And this is what I do in my free time. I read medical journals about hallucination experiences and see how they tie to the resurrection. And basically, the types of hallucinations that these people would have had, it's never happened in history, in the medical literature. People have auditory hallucinations, sometimes visual hallucinations, but never a multi-sense experience hallucination, especially on a mass hallucination scale. So, like, when you have some of these mass hallucinations that, like, the Catholic Church will promote, usually it's like we all saw something, but it was because a bunch of people got together and were waiting to see something. And then, oh, yeah, did you see it? Yeah, I think so. I think I saw that. And then, you have like 200 people that say, hey, we saw this, the Virgin Mary just popped up or whatever. And then all the people willing to die. And so, again, all this stuff, it's hard to explain the resurrection apart from it's hard to explain all these facts apart from the resurrection. And again, so I'm not expecting the resurrection argument to get you all the way, but again, we're building a cumulative case, right? And all these, as J. Warner Wallace says, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's just like one thing after another, after another, after another, after another, after another. The next one is the start of the church. So think about this. The people who would have been against Christianity had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to crush it. So if you were going to start a religion today and you wanted it to flourish, would you want to start it here in Kentucky or would you want to go start it in Iran? Where do you think it's most likely going to be successful? Probably here in Kentucky, right? You're going to be killed in a few weeks over in Iran. So this movement started as if we went to start something in Iran, okay? They were killing Christians, and then the Romans ended up sacking Jerusalem, and Christians were persecuted heavily. I mean, Nero was lighting Christians on fire and hanging them up to light the streets. So, and people don't join a movement like this unless they are utterly convinced it's true. Now, again, a lot of people die for an ideology, okay? We see this all the time. You see this specifically in the Muslim culture. They die for an ideology. But these people were dying for something that they claim to have seen and witnessed themselves. Now, people don't do that unless they're convinced that it's true. So it's hard to explain how the church would have gotten off the ground, and specifically the apostles and the first eyewitnesses, why they would have stuck to their guns. Many of them were martyred. Many of them were willing to be martyred, and many, many Christians were martyred. And why would they have done this unless they were utterly convinced that it was true? You have to explain that if you're going to present another theory. And again, so I think it's always helpful to compare this with like Islam or Mormonism. Muhammad started out being very friendly to the Christians, wasn't gaining a lot of traction, and then they started building this following, and they started raiding caravans and building this army and robbing and doing all this stuff, and they slowly built up this movement that started by military might and power. And the Mormons, although they didn't as much use violence, although there was some early on, it was basically, hey, we're going to move out west, and we're the new Jerusalem, and we're going to build this thing. And so they started taking money from people, and they started trying to invest it, and they started a bank, and they gave all these promises about where they were going. And again, it's easy to get people to follow into that. But when you're oppressed and saying, hey, we're going to kill you if you confess Christ, well, it's like, I wouldn't do that unless I was utterly convinced that this history was true. It's based on history, not an ideology. The next one would be Jesus' impact on the world. So again, Christianity, and this is, to me, this is really important too. Christianity is the only religion that has cross-cultural influence. So if you look at Islam, and again, I think it's a great case study against it, and even Hinduism and Buddhism, as a general rule, all those other religions, the other major ones, are confined to certain geographic areas or types of people. Now, certainly we have some of that infiltrating into the West, but as a general rule, those things are really tightly confined to certain geographies. And if they move into others, with Islam specifically, it's because Muslims are moving into a place and they are having more kids than other people, and they are creating a Muslim culture there. It's different with Christianity in that Christianity is spreading cross-culturally, and there's no boundary that keeps it from one culture, so it's not constrained to a culture. So Jesus is impacting people literally every tribe, tongue, and nation around the world, which points to its truth value, which points to the fact that it's not something that's culturally bound, which would make people more likely to believe it because they were in that culture. Number 11, and I've got 3 more to go, so we're almost there, or 4 more to go. The changed lives of those around us, people that are genuinely converted to Christ. And you see someone who's had a heart of stone and then they have a heart of flesh. Okay, so we're not talking about like, hey, I made a moral reformation. And again, we see that. I turned over a new leaf. We're talking about someone who's genuinely been converted, and it results in a humility and a love that's not natural. And then when we see this writ large in the church, it sends a powerful testimony. And Jesus actually said, this is one of the ways the world will know me and know this truth is because of you. And I think there's a warning in there for us that when we are not living like the church, we discredit our faith tremendously. And the world has a right to look. So there was a time when people would point to the church and say, okay, we don't agree with that, but those are really, really moral people now. Well, now the church often does not look any different from the world. And I think that's why Paul, they weren't, the New Testament passages that are harsh, they're always towards the church and the people in the church. It's love those who are outside the church. But the guy in the church who's having a bad witness, Paul says, don't have anything to do with him. Like, until he repents, because we don't want this stain in here. Number 12, this is one I think that resonates with a lot of people. Think about our greatest desires and our greatest problems that we have as human beings. So we have a guilt. Everyone has guilt, okay? They have moral guilt because we've all done things, and oftentimes we shudder to think about the things we've done, that if we go back and think on, what have I done? And sometimes I want to just push it out of my mind because I can't hardly sit with the fact that I've done this or that. So everyone has guilt. Everyone has identity issues, like they want to feel secure in who they are. And again, this whole sexual revolution thing, we see that a lot. Like people they're starving to feel this identity, and they're grasping at places to get it. People long for purpose, like they want a purpose in life. People long for safety, they long for security. We long for eternal life. Like we don't want to die. We long to live. We long for justice. We long for love. We long for a hero. Just look at the movies we watch. We worship heroes and lovers and people they just lift our souls up, and we're like, we want that. Well, all of those things find their resolution in one person. All of those deepest desires and needs and wants and wishes all find their fulfillment in one person. That through one act at the cross, somehow makes sense of all of those things in one event that happened. Again, another pointer to the truth of who Jesus is. Number 13, next to last, this is one many people probably heard. It's from C.S. Lewis. It's the Lord, Liar, Lunatic argument. So now I've kind of built this whole case. Think about everything we've talked about with Jesus, his person, who he is, the things he taught, the things he did. He claimed all these great moral truths and preached those, but he also claimed to be God and said that people that didn't follow him were going to go to hell, that you should leave your family to pick Jesus, that you should be willing to die for believing in Jesus, that you should worship him as God. So if Jesus really wasn't God, then it seems to me that there are only 2 other options based on everything we've talked about. That he is either the worst liar and the most evil person ever. Because for someone to tell you all of those things that you should do, they are not a good person. Or he's a lunatic, like he was just lying and he just didn't know it. Or he really is who he said he is. And I think Lewis rightly observed, it can't really, assuming that the picture of Jesus we have is accurate, which I think we've argued for that, there's no other option. And as you read and see Jesus' teaching and see his life, you can just see it. Like, he's not a liar. No one could talk like that and live like that was an evil, lying person. And he obviously wasn't crazy. Like, he's the most controlled, tempered figure in history. So the only other option is that he's Lord. And Lewis says, hey, we need to get rid of this stuff about him just being a good teacher. Like, he doesn't leave us that option. He's either Lord or he's not. And lastly, and I'm going to just read something that I think was really good, that in one of my professors in college, William Lane Craig, he does these debates, and he's just brilliant, but he always ends his debates, it doesn't matter who it is, inviting people to experience Christ for themselves. He says, I can do all these things, give all these arguments, but some kinds of knowing only happen when you step into a relationship with somebody and experience it. So until I committed myself to my wife, there was only so much that I could know about her until we committed to a relationship with each other. So let me read this to you, and I'll close with this, and then we can answer any questions. In the end, it is our experience of Christ through coming openly to the New Testament that will be the crowning evidence of all. There is ample ground for us at least to take the New Testament seriously and to come at it like someone testing a theory in science. I've many times commended genuine inquirers to read John's gospel with an open mind and pray, seriously, Lord, if you exist, open yourself to me as I read this gospel. A considerable number of people have come to know Christ in this way, often by chapter 7. If we really do have here the testimony to the living Lord, then we may expect him to meet with those who seek him genuinely with all their heart and mind. The New Testament shows us Christ. We reach out to him as eternal Lord and Savior with faith. We find him meeting us in our experiences. This drives us back to the New Testament to know him more. He increasingly illuminates the word to us, so we come to know not just more of him, but to know him more. So it continues more and more. It is increasingly true, as G.K. Chesterton said, that it is not so much that Christianity has been tried and found wanting, it's that it has not been tried. There is a pathetic lack of serious study, knowledge, or understanding of the New Testament in most people. Yet to the millions who have faced up to the New Testament and have from that come to know that Christ Jesus as Lord in their living experience, the evidence for Christ is overwhelming, and the Christ of that evidence overwhelms us. I am but one of those who would testify to this as reality and who would urge others to come to Christ. Like Thomas, doubts were overcome by faith and experience, and kneeling, we may say now, my Lord and my God. The one before whom we kneel is the Jesus of history, the risen and reigning Lord, the one at whose name every knee will bow, the cosmic creator and sustainer, the light of the world, the Messiah, the Word, the Savior, the Christ. So, any questions?